Hello, listeners. This is your host, Richard Sverrisson. Unfortunately, after we edited this episode, we discovered that we had some technical sound issues. Now, I hope that these won't detract from your enjoyment of the discussion I had with Anna. The technical problems were, unfortunately, all of my own making and nothing to do with the edit. So, apologies and please enjoy. Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Montel podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. Amid much talk of market intervention, one country has already implemented measures aimed at shielding energy users from soaring prices. Following on from several episodes looking at proposals to fix the energy market, this week we look closely at the Spanish intervention. What is it, and has it worked? Have there been any unintended consequences? Helping me, Richard Sverrisson, to discuss these issues is Anna Barillas of Aurora Energy Research. A warm welcome to you, Anna.
Thanks, Richard.
So why market intervention in Spain?
Yeah, so Spain is no different than the rest of European countries in trying to shield consumers from the high prices that we've been experiencing since mid last year, really. There are some differences to the Spanish market, I think, which probably meant that Spain and Portugal together moved earlier than others did. One is that consumers are fairly exposed to the wholesale price. So when you think about retail tariffs in the rest of Europe, a lot of them take into account kind of forward hedges or long-term contracts, or there's a tendency for the default tariff to be one that's fixed in some ways. In Spain, the default tariff, for lack of a better word, is actually exposed to wholesale prices, and that's a tariff that's used for vulnerable consumers. So there's been a lot of political pressure from the beginning to shield those consumers from the soaring prices.
And would it be wrong to say then that the Spanish market was broken and that it needed fixing?
Yeah, no, that's probably that's the subject of much debate, as you know, and among economists, kind of whether the kind of system is broken or not. I personally don't believe it is. There are always imperfections with every market design, but the reality is that the way that the Spanish market works, the way that power markets work generally in most of the developed world, is the same that commodity markets work everywhere else. So at the core of the design is the idea that electricity is a homogeneous good, and therefore prices should be homogeneous. So we can talk a little bit about the details of how it's designed, but in short, no, I don't think the market was broken.
Okay. Let's then talk in a little bit more detail about what Spain and Portugal did and how they intervened. Could you tell us a little bit about the so-called Spanish intervention and how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just for clarity, there have been several Spanish interventions since kind of the end of last year in September. The one we're talking about now is the price cap, as it's called, or Iberian exception is another way it has been described. So what it does is it effectively caps the price of gas that can be used to submit bids into the wholesale market. What that means is that gas plants that are exposed to high prices will see a regulated price effectively in terms of putting their bids into the market. Of course, they will face a higher cost when purchasing that gas, so there's a compensation that needs to be paid to them for the difference. The way that's done is the total cost of that compensation is then allocated to those consumers that are purchasing energy in the wholesale market to calculate an additional euro per megawatt hour cost. So what you will see if you look into kind of Red Eléctrica or RENs, which are the two TSOs in Spain and Portugal, is a wholesale price, and then a compensation adjustment on top. Now, what this does is it effectively caps the inframarginal rents of all generators that are below gas in the merit order. So the gain to consumers comes from that saving, from the fact that you are not paying nuclear or renewables the price that would result from the market price of gas, but the capped price of gas.
So you're solving then the issue of high prices, certainly, and you're shielding the energy users. But are you solving the issue which is at the core here, which is the lack of supply of gas, in a sense?
No, not at all. Not at all. And, I think that has been one of the key challenges from the implementation of this measure. So what it has done is it has created prices in Iberia that are much lower than the rest of Europe. Now, of course, that was part of the plan and the objective. So from that perspective, the mechanism has worked. But what it has also done is increase the exports of Spain, in this case, to France. Now, traditionally, Spain imported energy from France. In this case, it's exporting energy to France. Now, that in itself is not a problem. The problem is that it has caused the generation from CCGTs, from gas-fired plants, to increase. So the mechanism actually has resulted in almost a doubling, if not more, of the amount of gas used in the power sector. Now, this has been a very complicated year, and it would be unfair to suggest that that is solely the effect of the mechanism, because it is also true that we had a very hot summer, and so cooling demand increased. And we also have had very low hydro reservoir levels in Iberia, particularly in Portugal, or across Spain and Portugal. And so, there are several reasons for this, but this mechanism has definitely increased the amount of gas consumption for power generation in Spain.
So, an unintended consequence then, you could say, is that it's increased demand for gas.
Absolutely, exactly what we should be trying to avoid. And that is the challenge with all of these mechanisms that impact the price that consumers see in one way or the other, right? So prices have, the effect of prices should be to guide consumption. When prices are high, people should stop consuming, whether that's gas or electricity. In this case, obviously, by capping the price, then you've had an increase in consumption.
So this is very interesting. Do you think then this kind of intervention could work across Europe?
No, so it's quite challenging, and you would have seen that when the interventions that are being discussed in Europe are actually not a price cap, but a revenue cap, and we can go into the differences that creates and why it is even though it sounds similar, it's a very important difference. The reality is there are several limitations to implementing something like this in the rest of Europe. The first is that, as I just mentioned, one of the key challenges of the implementation of the Iberian mechanism has been the increased exports to France and the price difference that it has created. If you think about the wider European context, Germany is interconnected with, I think, 13 different kind of regions, all of which face slightly different gas prices, have a different generation mix. So it would be impossible to implement something like this and not distort the import and export signals that the market is used to. I think that's one. In terms of the effectiveness of it, I think there are also a couple of important differences. The first is that in Spain, a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of consumers are actually exposed to the wholesale price. And so there is a fairly direct impact between capping wholesale prices and capping retail tariffs. That is not necessarily the case in the rest of Europe. Of course, it's a very heterogeneous market, and that varies across the different countries. But the Iberian market, Spain in particular, is an exception in that. So the impact wouldn't be as direct. And then the other important consideration related to that is the lack of long-term hedges typically in the Iberian market, which means that you are directly impacting consumers with this measure. Because the reality is that within the wholesale market in Iberia, liquidity hasn't been high historically. And so the majority of trades happen in the day-ahead market. And so by impacting day-ahead prices, you can have a direct impact on cost. That is not the case in the rest of Europe. Again, it varies by country. France, for example, all of the nuclear plant has long-term CFD contracts, for lack of a better term. In Germany, you probably can have a significant impact because a lot of the generation is actually in a one-way CFD. But again, that varies across countries. And so I think it would be fairly difficult to implement something like that.
I mean, when you're talking about the flows to France, you're talking power chiefly, or power and gas? Or
Power
yeah,
primarily,
exactly.
yes.
Okay. So, and CFD is talking about contracts for differences for those listeners who are unaware of that abbreviation. But has the Spanish and the Portuguese governments, have they set a time frame for this intervention, when it will finally end, or because it's not a permanent measure, is it?
No, it is not a permanent measure. It is meant to go through the end of May of 2023. So one of the requirements for the implementation of this measure early on when it was implemented. So this was implemented on the 15th of June of 2022. And one of the requirements was that it was a temporary measure and that it would end, by the end of May of next year.
Okay, and so there's always a danger, though, that there's a temptation when policymakers implement such a measure that it gets extended. I mean, do you think there's a likelihood that it could be extended throughout all of next year, maybe?
I think there is actually, and that is again some of the risk of these market interventions are the stickiness of them. So first, they create a precedent. I think in this case, for example, when we talk about the European kind of context, the revenue cap is being discussed is at a high enough level that I think you could argue it continues to incentivize investment. That's the argument. In the case of Iberia, prices have continued to be significantly higher than I think realistically any investor could have hoped for a couple of years ago. So from that perspective, I don't think it's been as detrimental to investment. The problem is that it sets a precedent for this type of intervention, and there's no guarantee that if it gets extended, if it gets re-implemented, it will be done at different levels, and levels that are less conducive to investment. And I also think the stickiness is a problem. The reality is that we don't expect at Aurora that gas prices will come down significantly in the next kind of year or so. So the next winter, the winter 23-24, we'll probably have a lot of the same issues, if not worse, depending on how cold it is. And so if the objective of these measures was to limit impact on consumers, that probably won't have changed by next winter. And it is likely that the measures get extended.
Because, as you say, the situation is not, it doesn't look like it's going to ease anytime soon. And I think once the storage levels come down next year, and then we're looking at another pretty grim winter in many ways. There's a lot of talk and certainly at the policy level within Brussels and at national government level to decouple power from gas.
Yes.
Has Spain succeeded there?
Well, they have. I mean, this mechanism does decouple kind of power from gas. So from that perspective, I think they have. Whether I would call that a success from other perspectives around kind of market design and what that does to investment signals, and I don't mean renewables, I mean things like flexibility, storage, things that are incredibly important for the energy transition, then I'm not sure that's a success necessarily. If the narrow lens through which we are evaluating this is consumer prices and limiting the impact of gas directly on consumers, and I think it's fair to say that the mechanism has done what it was meant to do.
But it could have, if I understood you correctly, Anna, it could have sort of ramifications for the energy transition, in effect delay or slow down much needed investment, as you say, in batteries, in this storage, in this sort of flexibility offers on both the demand and on the supply side.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about what the mechanism does, right, and how things like batteries make money. So what a storage asset will try to do is it will try to charge the battery when prices are lowest and discharge when prices are higher. So arbitrage within day prices, effectively. What this mechanism does is probably not a whole lot on the low end of prices, but it caps the upside. So it reduces the spread that batteries can make, and therefore, impacts the business case for technologies like batteries. Obviously, it's not just batteries, but it's just an example to highlight kind of the consequences of something like this.
Yeah, I mean, that brings me on to my next question, which has also been criticised for potentially hampering investments. Oh, we have a siren outside the banner. But is the Euro 118 per megawatt hour revenue cap? That's also been criticised for potentially stalling investments or maybe creating uncertainty for investors. What's your view here? Is this cap a good idea?
Yeah, so so we talked a little bit about why a mechanism like the one in Iberia would have been difficult to implement at the European level. So I think what the proposal that the European Commission has put forward, which is a revenue cap set at 180 euros per megawatt hour, it's effectively a post, kind of after the fact or ex post clawback mechanism on revenues. I think that there's a couple of benefits from that mechanism versus a price cap. First is that it doesn't affect wholesale prices. And so the challenges we were talking about in terms of flows of power across borders, etc., are not necessarily distorted. I think that's an important kind of benefit. I think the other benefit or the other thing I can say it's been good in the way it's being proposed, and we'll see if it's implemented, of course, is that it's at a high enough level that it shouldn't have a huge impact on investment decisions, and that was very much explicit in the proposal from the Commission. 180 is a price at which few investors, if any, would have considered kind of an upside of revenues. So the fact that that's what's being used as a cap should be a positive. I understand the pressure that the Commission is under to do something. It is an incredibly difficult situation for a lot of consumers, and not just residential, but also industry. It's always a risk of market intervention, and that's probably the biggest challenge with it.
I mean, this podcast, we're recording it early in the week, but we're going out on Friday when there's kind of expectations of several measures coming from the energy ministers' meeting. What are your expectations here, or what are your main concerns, maybe? If we can put it that way.
Yeah. So listen, it's very hard to know what of the proposed measures will be implemented. I think there's probably a fair amount of support for the revenue cap. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's approved. I think there's a fair amount of support for efficiency measures and the reduction in demand that has been proposed. I think that's fairly uncontroversial. How it's implemented, of course, will be how much it matters and how much it does is down to how it's implemented. But I think that's, there's no reason to suggest that saving energy is not a good idea in this case. So I think that's to be expected. I think there's a few other measures, as you know, that have been proposed. But those, to me, are the ones that I think probably have the biggest support. I think my hope for whatever comes out of this is just clarity on kind of for how long this will be implemented, and with a dose of realism in terms of, again, if we're in a kind of dire situation kind of next winter, will this be extended? I think it's almost better to flag that these are the conditions under which this has been approved, and these are the conditions that have to change before we take this away. I think that's probably to some extent better than the constant uncertainty once the period for which these measures have been proposed, which is through March of next year, I believe. The sentiment of will this be extended, will it be kind of reintroduced again ahead of the winter? So I think clarity is probably my biggest hope.
Absolutely, I think that's what clarity and a little bit of certainty in terms of how long these measures could potentially last. especially if we get to February and early March, and I mean, we need to sort of find out how long these will be in place. But do you find that there's a kind of disconnect or maybe even a rift between sort of energy ministers of the southern parts of Europe and those in the north? I mean, are they more pro-interventionist or liable to step in and to fix things for consumers rather than in the north, or is that maybe an overgeneralization?
No, I mean, listen, we're generalizing in this conversation in many ways, right? I mean, Europe it is not a single market, and we're talking about Europe as it were. So yeah, we're generalizing anyway. I think there has definitely been more history and more precedent on market intervention in Southern Europe. I think it's fair to say that kind of the northern parts of Europe have been more hesitant to intervene and very much pro-market. I think what is fairly surprising, not anymore, but it was fairly surprising from this debate a couple of months ago, is that it got to the point where Ursula von der Leyen and kind of ministers from the northern countries were suggesting market interventions were needed. I think that's what's shocking. It's that the change to some degree, that even in countries like Germany, there's been a lot of appetite for some sort of intervention. So I think that it's probably started that way when Iberia proposed a mechanism earlier in the year. It was very much the outlier, and it was very much a sentiment of, okay, you get an exception because you're different, you're an island, you have little forward trades, etc. Fine, you go ahead and do it, but we're only going to allow it temporarily to the rest of Europe, actually, even looking to Iberia to see whether something like that could have been implemented.
To follow the Spanish example, really, in a way. It's certainly not an outlier anymore, is it?
Exactly.
It's more the standard, if you like, standard kind of intervention. It's very interesting. Also, I find very interesting is the language used at the Commission now. They're looking at regulated prices, which they've always railed against in the past and tried to undo them, and also long-term contracts. So there's been quite a U-turn, if you like, or a change in direction. Of course, given the immense pressure and the crisis that we're in. So it's, in a way, sometimes it's understandable. But I'd like to. We're talking about these emergency measures, these sort of short-term interventions. But there are also other plans on the table for more longer-term reform of market design. What's your view here? Is the marginal, the marginal cost model, is that broken? Does it need fixing? Is it going to be fit for purpose when we come into markets which are far more renewables than they do now, when we're getting close to sort of maybe 80, 90, 100%?
Yeah. So again, this is my view. Economists kind of differ as to kind of what the answer to this is. I do not think the market is broken. Again, I think something that is often misconceived is that the marginal price system is unique to power markets, and it isn't, right? If you go to the supermarket, you pay a price for cucumber. It doesn't really matter where it comes from. There's differences. There might be organic or not, but largely, the idea of you're buying one commodity and the price is homogeneous, it applies to commodity markets everywhere. So it is not unique to power. It is also probably worth saying that marginal price systems haven't been the way markets have always been organized, but it has been the way most markets have transitioned to. What that suggests is that there have been other ways that have been tried, and marginal price systems like the one we have now have been deemed to be the most efficient way of organizing power markets. And if you look across the last 20 years, they have led to innovation and lower prices for consumers. There are interesting case studies in the US, for example, where the transition to an ISO type market or TSO market, which is organized in the same way that Europe is, has lower prices for consumers. So I don't think it's broken from that perspective. The problem we have now is not a problem with the mechanism, it's a problem with high gas prices and our reliance on high gas prices. What a market is meant to do is provide investment signals, and again, that's what the market right now is doing. So no, I don't think it's broken. I don't think it needs fixing. I have heard other alternatives proposed, effectively separating, and there's many flavors to this, but it probably boils down to a separation of what we call now inframarginal technologies, so things like renewables, nuclear, hydro, into a separate pool than those things like gas plants, whether that's combined cycles or peaking plants and other flexible technologies. And listen, I'm not suggesting that there isn't a way to make this work. I think there's a lot of challenges in those designs we probably won't get into that would need to be sorted before we can deem that a better mechanism than the one we have now. And that's just not something that I think can be done in a few months. I think it's something that would take a couple of years at least to implement.
It's certainly not lacking in complexity.
Absolutely. No, it isn't. And the more you peel the layers of the proposals, the more issues you find with them. I think one of the most difficult things to do, which I think will become increasingly important in the future, is locational signals. The way the market is designed now allows for, doesn't have to be nodal, but locational signals in markets. That becomes incredibly difficult if what you end up having is separate auctions for this type of technologies. Effectively, we would be saying that you would need kind of a different auction for wind in one part of the country versus another. And that's just, to me, it sounds very difficult to manage. That's just one difficulty.
Absolutely. I think it's a subject that I'd very much like to return to with you, Anna, when we have a little bit more on the table, a little bit more meat. It seems to be very kind of vague and a little bit sort of sketchy. But Anna, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, Richard. It was great to be here.
So, listeners, you can now follow the podcast on our own Twitter account, aptly named the Montel Weekly Podcast. Please direct message any suggestions, questions, or let us know if you think you have a good idea for a guest on the show. You can also send us an email to podcast@montelnews.com. Lastly, remember to keep up to date with all that's happening in energy markets on Montel News. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you and goodbye.